Are there any not too expensive, fine or extra fine nibs that are really wet? Or a way to increase the flow in a pen without making the line wider, assuming good paper so it doesn't just spread? I have small handwriting but love shading and sheen. So I imagine this is probably coming off of, what I talked about a couple of weeks ago with, getting good sheen and shading, and how you don't necessarily have to have a very, broad or italic pen, especially when using shimmering inks and stuff like that, how you can use a wetter writing, fine or extra fine. The challenge that I had with answering your specific question here was the not too expensive part, because most of the wetter, fine and extra fine nibs that I have experience with are gold nibs, which then pretty much immediately jump it into what I would consider to be expensive. If it's $140, $150 or more, that's really probably a little more expensive. And most of those are going to be your German and Italian pens. These are going to be your European pens. Most of the Japanese fines and extra fines, no matter the price, are going to be a little bit on the finer side. So even though if they write a little bit wetter, they're going to be much finer in size than their European counterparts. The kind of exception to that is some of the pilot nibs, like their medium nibs, tend to be a little bit wetter, a little bit broader, and a little bit closer to the European sizes. So I find that Japanese extra fines and fines tend to be a little, on the finer side. Their mediums and broads tend to lean a little bit more towards kind of the standard European sizes. So there's that to take into consideration. But I think you'll have to play around just a little bit and kind of see which one. So pilot, the medium, if you go with a medium steel like on the Metropolitan, that might kind of get you where you need to go. It's not the same as writing with, say, a Lamy medium or something like that might be a little bit wetter. Most of the Jowo nibs tend to be a little bit on the wetter side, so that would be any of the Goulet nibs, which you'd have to swap into a pen, Edison nibs, which I don't know if you consider Edison's to be on the not so expensive side, and TWSBI as well is using Jowo. So some of those, not as much maybe the extra fines, but the fines could kind of fit in that category. So I think that's a good way to go. And that's about the best option that I have right now in terms of the not so expensive side. But I wanted to answer, really focus on the second half of your question, which is, is there a way to increase flow in a pen without making the line wider? Yes, there is, sort of. It's a little bit of hacking, and it's a little bit of, you're entering into, warranty void disclaimer territory here. So I'm going to talk about, modifying your nib and your feed to be wetter, which is difficult to go back and undo, and it's also easy to do wrong. So if you screw it up, please don't blame me. So I will touch on that for a hot second. And I'm actually going to use an Edison as an example for how to do it. So this is, of course, I picked one without a nib on it. Let's see, let me pick something else. Nemesine. Let's go with Nemesine, similar kind of setup. So it's got a number 6 nib on it. Let's say my Nemesine is writing too dry. I want to modify it to write a little bit wetter. So there's a couple of different ways you can do that. You can do that either by modifying the feed, basically increasing the flow that's coming up to the nib in the first place, or you can modify the tines of the nib to write wetter so that more ink will just kind of come down. So it's kind of two different ways of looking at. One is like increasing the supply that's coming to the feed. The other one is increasing the draw that's coming out of the nib. So either way could work. But what you want to do, again, heavy disclaimer here. So you pull the nib and the feed out. And if you notice, I'm going to zoom in a little bit here. The way that the feeds are set up, this is basically all fountain pen feeds are in some form or fashion like this. Coming down your feed here is this very, very small channel. I can't even get it easily without the glare. Very, very small channel here. This is called the feed channel or the ink channel. And this comes all the way down. So this connects back from where your ink reservoir is drawing the ink down, and then it comes up to the top here, and that's where it mates up to the nib. And then your ink is then transferred to the nib and comes down the slit to the tip of the nib. So one way that you can increase flow is you can actually take an exacto knife and you can drag it down the middle of that channel, and basically you can either deepen that channel or you can kind of cut into it and try to widen it. Now, that said, this is where it's really easy to screw it up, and you cannot undo it if you do it wrong, especially on these plastic feeds. Ebonite feeds, you have a little more room to work with, but these plastic feeds, you know, you basically just have to go really slow and really carefully, and then keep, you know, putting the nib back on and trying it and seeing if that helps. If you do it too much, you really can't undo it, so then you'll end up with just a crazy wet pen, or a pen that's so wet that it blobs and stuff like that. You don't want to do that. So you want to be very careful and just drag it down very intentionally and do that. That's the one way you can do it, is with the feed. There's a couple of different things you can do with the nib itself, which if you have it installed on the pen, so you can, again, use an exacto knife. You know, it probably would have been helpful if I had one on me to show you what the heck is even going on. I don't even know that I have one in my office here to show you right now. So sorry about that. We'll have to talk conceptually. So you can take an exacto knife and you can actually put it in between the tines here. And you can use it to take the knife and you just bend it a little bit side to side, and you're actually taking those tines and you're forcing them to spread apart a little bit. Now, if you do that enough, you're actually going to widen the tip, widen the two tines from each other, and it is going to increase the line width because you're moving it that much. If you do it just a hair, it's not going to change the tip size drastically, but it will increase that flow quite a bit. Typically, you're only doing that when it's a problem, when you're having flow issues and it's writing too dry, like it's skipping and stuff like that. Then, you know, I've seen nibmeisters use that trick to open up the tines a little bit and get it to flow just like it should, not necessarily to just make it flow wetter, but that is definitely one technique to do. The other technique, which doesn't require a knife, is if you are using the nib and you just want to widen the flow a little bit, you can actually just take and you can press it down and kind of force it. Force the nib, like flex it a little bit and spread those tines, which with a steel nib is kind of difficult to do. But you can do that. That will also open up the tines a little bit. The risk with that is that if you flex it too much, you can actually take the nib and you can end up bending it up like that, and it comes up and away from the feed, and that is not so ideal because that'll break the flow and it'll cause more problems than it will help. But that's a similar kind of concept to what you're doing with the knife, except you don't have to use a knife. So those are 3 different techniques you can do. Again, this is purely at your own risk, and I would only recommend that you try it if you are prepared emotionally to scrap whatever pen you're working on if you're experimenting with it. So don't try it on any precious pens that you have or anything that is particularly meaningful to you. I would just be cautious about doing those techniques, but that's the basic concept of how it's done. Again, I don't do any of this stuff commercially, so to speak. I mean, this is like nib tuning territory here, and I understand conceptually how to get it done. I've had it explained to me from some folks, but I do not do it on a regular basis. So please don't go doing this with some really expensive rare pen and then come back and say, Brian, you ruined my pen. Just use caution, but that's the basic concept. And then, of course, to kind of wrap up that conversation, you know, if you're to the point where you're like, I don't really want to modify my nib, I kind of have what I have, then you can use some ink and paper to kind of control it as well. You know, you talked about having good paper. If you love sheen, Tomoe River is pretty much the best paper to use for that I've experienced. That will actually draw sheen out of inks where you would think that they shouldn't even come from. So just switching to the paper could draw that sheen out a lot more. Granted, it's not in a lot of different notebook formats and stuff, but it can definitely look to do that. And then you know, you can look to switch to different inks, higher sheening inks as well. You know, Shimmertastic inks and the Jer Bond 1670 series and things like that, where you can definitely draw some more of that kind of sparkliness out of it, even in some of the finer nibs. So those are my recommendations. Hopefully that helps you out.